Hi, and welcome back. And in this particular section of the course, we're going to start talking about configuring an effective version control environment. So some of the things you're going to need to do to configure that environment are, one, to start setting up your workspaces correctly. Now, we've talked a little bit about workspaces, but we're going to focus a video on that topic specifically. Then we're going to talk about source control settings that are project-wide settings that we're going to want to set right after we start the project or just before we start the project, but we don't want to wait too long. We want to get those settings in place. I'm going to show you which ones you can go out setting and how you go out setting them up. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the MISKEY provider. The MISKEY provider allows backwards compatibility with prior versions of Visual Studio, such as Visual Studio 2008 and 2010, integrate with the TFS 2017 version control system. So if you're on older versions of Visual Studio and you're comfortable there and you can't upgrade, but you want to take advantage of TFS 2017 because that's what your organization is deployed, you use the MISKEY provider to bridge that gap. So with that, we're going to start out by talking about the workspaces. You're going to understand how you work with the workspaces. So what will you learn? Well, we're going to talk about creating, editing, and deleting or removing workspaces. We're going to talk about cloaking and uncloaking files and local and remote workspaces. And that's a biggie. We'll want to talk to that one. Now, we've talked to some of these topics already throughout this course. And we're going to focus in on them, this particular section more, so you get all the information you need about the workspaces. We've touched on a little bit here and a little bit there. We want to focus on that in this particular video. So what do we talk about creating, editing, and deleting a workspace? It's pretty much straightforward. You just have to use Team Explorer to manage your workspaces. We've showed you a little bit earlier, like how we go in and work with a workspace. I can use the command line, or I can use the Team Explorer, like I said, and we're going to go in and show you in the video how you go about and create, edit, delete, remove the workspaces. And then we're going to talk about cloaking and uncloaking files. So basically, when I talk to teams, a lot of people don't understand what cloaking does, and there's some folks that do, but not, the teams I talk to, a lot of the folks don't understand cloaking for some reason. And what cloaking is, the ability to hide files from downloading them. So what we do is we'll set up a workspace environment and we'll make it granular in terms of its structure. So as you can tell from this image here, we start off with a project, then we go to project down to the documentation directory and then down to a specific file. And we cloak that particular documentation directory and that specific file. And the reason we do that is because we don't really need them to do the development, or we don't want them being messed with at all. So for example, documentation is probably not needed for building our source control code. So we want to make sure that even though it's important, we keep it in version control. There's no reason we have to download it every time we want to work with TFS in our code. So that's what cloaking does. It allows us to hide those files and allows us to keep that workspace a lot cleaner than, less cluttered with all the stuff that we're bringing down. The other thing is you can use it during the build process too. So maybe you don't want to use it during your everyday working project, when you're working in your workspace on a day-to-day basis. But during a build, times really are something that companies like to keep an eye on. They don't want long build times. And so we want to make sure that we cut off any extraneous information that needs to be pulled down. We don't want the documentation probably because it doesn't compile. We're not compiling it into the application. So build engine is going to run and just compile the code. We want to make sure it just has just what it needs and nothing more. That way we keep not only the workspace clean, but we keep lightweight builds and less time running the build. And then we have this idea of local versus remote workspaces, or server workspaces as they call them. Local workspaces allow us to work offline. I brought this up a little bit earlier. It allows us to work offline from TFS. Now, TFS really requires you to be tied to a server in order to interact with it. So Microsoft came up with this idea of what they call local workspaces, and that allows us to work remotely or offline from TFS. And when you can restore files maybe that you delete locally. So let's say we're working and we delete some files. You can very easily restore those files because they haven't been deleted out of TFS yet. And when we hook back in, so we can use any editor to create or work with our files. So if you want to use Notepad, that's fine. You want to use Visual Studio Code, that's fine. whatever you want to use to create or manage your code files, you can do in a local workspace, because Visual Studio is going to automatically recognize that those files have changed, and it's going to detect those changes and allow you to check them back in when you get hooked back into TFS again. So for example, you'd see all these pending changes start showing up when you made changes to the files outside of Visual Studio. Next, we have the server workspaces. Okay, we have to be tied to the server. You want to make sure that, again, we working with TFS, and one of the things that we have to be careful of is that we aren't going to be able to work very well in an offline mode. Okay, offline work is difficult because you can't actually go in and modify the files in whatever editor you like you can do in local. The reason you can is because there's a lock on them for read-only. So all these files are tagged read-only, and if I was to make changes to them, even if I could make changes, Visual Studio is not picking up those changes. Due to the nature of the server workspaces, it demands that we have a connection back to Visual Studio or back to TFS from Visual Studio, because the server workspace is on the server. Okay, and so those are two different ways to look at the workspaces. And then obviously performance is going to be an issue with server workspaces. And again, you don't want to degrade your performance at all if you can help it. Microsoft defaults to the local workspaces, so I would really encourage us to use local workspaces. When we did talk about server workspaces, though, earlier, we were talking about it in the context of locking. If you want to do what they call a checkout lock, you can't do a checkout lock on a local workspace. You have to do it on a server workspace. So just keep that in mind. If you feel like you need checkout locks on your system, then obviously server workspaces is what you're going to have to use. And if you don't remember the locking pieces, go ahead back into the section 2 of the course and look at the locking video, and it talks through all of that. But just either way, you're going to be fine. Just pick the one that you want to work with based on your needs and run with it. All right, so I'm here in my demo environment in Visual Studio. And what we want to do is start showing you how we're going to work with workspaces. I know we've been over this a little bit already, but we want to make sure that we hit home with this one, because workspace structure is really important when we're working with Team Foundation Server's version control system. So you'll notice here on the left side, I have an application. And you'll notice these little icons next to it. So you see here, Tailspin Toys -dev. There's these little icons, and above there's another one. Those icons are showing that there's a branch there. These are branches off of something. So, for example, Tailspin Toys is the main line, and then Tailspin Toys Dev is the branch off of that main line. So that's what that's basically telling me there. So one of the things that I want to draw your attention to is we have our local path, and you can notice up here it says not mapped right there in the center of your screen. It looks like a hyperlink. What we want to do is make sure that the first thing we do is map the local workspace, the working directory, back to our TFS instance. So what I want to do is I want to actually go a little more granular than a project level. So I could come up here and I could map that workspace, and I could bring everything down to my machine. But to me, that's not necessary. I don't need all the Tailspin Toys and then all the dev branch. I'm only working in one branch at a time, okay? And that'll give me like 2 copies of everything. I don't need that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to Tailspin Toys Dev, and I'm going to highlight that. I'm going to go over to the not mapped and click on that. It's going to bring up the mapping dialog. And what it's doing is it's looking at that particular server folder, the dev, and it's asking me where do I want to put it locally. And locally, we're just going to put it in the sources directory. So we're going to go down here to sources, and there's source, and then workspaces, and we're going to put it inside there. And so that will be the folder name inside the workspace, and it's going to be recursive. It means it's going to go through and recurse through the whole directory structure. And I'm going to select map. Now, one of the things it's going to ask me is, do you want to do a get? And it's what this is saying is the get operation requires that the current solution be closed. Are you sure you want to close the current solution? So yes, I do. If you have one open, it's going to ask you to close it. And then it's going to ask you to say if newly mapped items will be downloaded until you execute a get. So you want to make sure that when you create the workspace, you don't have to necessarily bring all the files down. If you want to start working with the files, obviously you're going to want to click here, yes, bring them down. Otherwise, you just click no, and all it's done is created the workspace mapping for you. Later on, you can actually bring all the files down. In my case, I want to get everything local, so I'm going to go ahead and click yes. It's going to go out there and it's going to download all those files onto my local machine so I can start working in TFS with my application. Okay, so everything downloaded successfully. Now we're all set, and you can see up here we have our local path is now mapped with a hyperlink. So what we've done is now set up that workspace mapping for us. And what I want to do is go up into here into the Workspaces dropdown right here in the center of the screen. And I'm going to click on the Workspaces option. And you can see there's two different workspaces available right now. And it's usually the name of your computer. And then if you add a second one, it would be the name of your computer with an _1. So this is my computer's name. And this is the one I want to look at right now. So I'm going to click on that and I'm going to select the edit. And it's going to show me all the active projects and cloaked files and projects, everything that's in that workspace. And you can see there's quite a bit in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit because I don't need all that stuff in the one workspace. I want to have my Workspaces project, not all my projects in a workspace. So what I could do is very easily go into here and remove this. And we're going to remove this one. And we're going to remove this one. So that leaves us with the dev. Okay, so now I have my dev branch in its workspace. I'm going to change this name up here to desktop name of computer _dev so we understand what's in that particular workspace. I'm going to click on advanced. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to show you that, okay, here's the owner, here's our computer name, obviously, and the name of the workspace. You notice, though, we have a server workspace. I don't necessarily want a server workspace. It will work because, obviously, if I want to create checkout locks, I will need that server workspace. And you can work that just fine, but the problem is that I might work remotely or disconnected. And I can't work offline of TFS very well with a server workspace. So what you can do is just select a local workspace and file time is current or the check-in. When does the file time get set when you're working with the files? So during the check-in process, do you take that time or do you take whatever the current time is and stamp the files with that? And we're going to leave it at current. And then permissions. Is it a private workspace or a public workspace? Or a public limited workspace for that matter? So private workspaces are just yours. No one else can have access to them. But if you decide to have a public workspace, and I've seen people do this, is they will set up a public workspace on a file share somewhere. And then what their teammates will do is everybody will access that particular workspace when they're working with their files. Now, that sounds really good on the surface that, we have it on a shared drive. I don't have to have it all local on my machine. The only issue with that is that if you have 3 or 4 people working out of the same workspace, and I mean the same workspace, not a copy of it, then you're going to have all kinds of conflicts arise. So I don't advise doing that, but there are reasons why you may want to. And again, setting a public workspace will allow everybody to have access to it. 9 times out of 10, you're just going to need a private workspace, and I'm going to go ahead and leave this one private. And I can add any comments, and then down here you can see it has the local working folder set up. So I'm going to click on the advanced again. I'm going to select OK. And now we've basically updated, it's updating the workspace with the files and everything, making sure that it's all correct and everything, because we did remove some things and we just want to make sure that everything in that workspace is what needs to be in that workspace. And so it's going to do its thing here. And 1 or more working folders in version control have changed. Do you want to get the latest files from version control to update your workspace? Well, yes, I do. Because it's been modified, I want to make sure I have all the right files so we have a good starting point. The other thing I want to do is look at our number 1 here, our first one, edit that. You'll notice that we have a specific project in there, and that's fine. I like that, and so I'm going to call this CMMI, actually packed CMMI, and we're going to say OK there. So now that's one set, and I'm going to add another one, and this time I'm going to add it for Tailspin main, and I'm going to go on to here and I'm going to go down to the Tailspin Toys and to the main branch. And I'm going to obviously map that locally. So we're going to go to C, Users, Source, Workspaces. And we'll select OK. Now, we did have a workspace there already. So we may run into an issue here and I may have to clean it up, but we'll see. Before I save it though, I'm going to go on to the advanced side and you can see this is all set up with a local workspace and a private workspace, and everything else looks pretty good here. So I'm just going to click OK. And what it's basically saying is it's already got a mapped workspace in that same directory. So what that's telling me is that when I try to map a workspace to a directory that already contains files from a different workspace, it won't let me map that. So I have to go to a different folder level that's either at that same level or higher. I can't actually put a folder in Workspaces and try and map to it. It will cause me some issues. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to click OK here. And I'm going to go and do this. We're going to go to C, Users, Paul. And I'm going to do it at this level right here. Okay. And again, this is you may have to go do some planning around this because again, this is really what's important is you don't want your files all over your hard drive. You want to kind of keep them contained. So having an understanding of how you can structure your workspace is really important. So I'm just going to select that one. I'm going to select OK, and it's saying that dev is already mapped. Let's go back here and see what's going on. See users Paul. Let's click OK again. So it doesn't like me going all the way down there. So let's see what we can do here. Let's change this all together to the D drive, okay? And say OK here. And now it'll ask me, do I want to get the latest? So just so you understand, there are times where you have to structure things in a way that's going to allow you to not run into these conflicts when you're trying to map your workspaces, especially if you start getting into 3, 4, 5 different workspaces. Now, you may be asking, why would I go about doing 2 workspaces on the same project instead of just one workspace with 2 line items in it? And what I want to tell you is that when I'm working, I may be working from the dev branch, okay? I want to work strictly on the dev branch and know that the files I'm working with are strictly from the dev branch. And then if I'm in main, I want to know I'm strictly working with those in main. If I have everything in the same workspace, I could accidentally start working on the main files when in reality I need to be working on the dev or vice versa. So when this wraps up, I will show you how we go about working with the workspaces in our regular activities. And okay, it's all set up now. Brought everything down. One of the other items I want to show you before we close this out is the Show Remote Workspaces option. I'm going to check that, and you're going to see this whole list of workspaces coming out of there. Okay, and you see here we have a build server. So we have all these different workspaces that are out there on the server, workspaces. And so I have the ability to go and clean them up if I want to. For example, I don't need this one here anymore, this one here, or this one here. So I can go ahead and remove those. And are you sure you want to delete the selected workspaces? Any pending changes will be lost because it's a permanent remove. At which point they're removed, we're good, everything looks good, and we can move on. And again, you may want to do this once in a while, is go in and clean up your workspace. So I'm going to close that. We now have mapped our workspace. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually double click on the Tailspin Toys and open up that particular project. And if we go to Solution Explorer, we probably should see it already open, so I don't even have to go about opening it. You will see here some different files that are available, and I'm going to click on the About file. And I'm just going to make a small edit here. We're going to call this About Us Dev, just so we kind of know what we're working in here, because we're in the Dev branch. And I'm going to save that. Okay, so everything's saved now. Go back to Source Control Explorer and go back to Team Explorer over here. I want to show you 2 things. So one of them is the pending changes. You'll notice I have all these pending changes now. There's the About Us, or the About ASPX page that we just made changes to, and then the other OBJs and the debugs and things like that that really don't need to go into TFS. And so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to go over here. I'm going to switch now to my main, and we're going to start working in main. And one of the things you'll notice right away is now everything has kind of shifted over into the main side. So what I have to do up here is I switch this to main and allow us to now only work in the workspace that we want to work in. My changes are still there for dev. I'm just switching over to main to do some work, and I can switch back to dev and my changes are still there. And I can switch back to dev here, and I can continue to work in dev here. So it's just a way, workspaces are just a way to compartmentalize your source code on your local machine with its relationship back to Team Foundation Server. So with that, I'd like to just wrap up. So let's go back to the slides. All right, so what did you learn in this particular video? Well, we talked about creating, editing, deleting, or removing workspaces. We talked about cloaking and uncloaking files. And we talked about local versus remote or server repository or workspaces. So again, we covered quite a bit of information here, and it's a little longer than most of my videos, but I really think that it's important that you understand how well you can work with these workspaces to structure your source control on your machine, on your local machine.